Hi everybody, welcome back to another JBoz Gaming video. This is your host JBoz, and today we're going to talk about ammo types. Before we get into the detail of ammunition and the different types there are, we need to talk about some terms. The first term I'd like to introduce is high explosive. There are certain types of shells that are considered high explosive shells, and these shells can always do some damage even if they do not penetrate the armor. So we'll talk about that more in just a minute when we get into these types of shells, but I want to define that term. The other thing I want to define is RNG. What that stands for is random number generator. And what happens is there's a little bit of randomness when you're shooting your shell at another tank. The first indication is, or the first thing that you have to determine is whether that shell actually penetrates that particular piece of armor. And of course, armor is measured in millimeters thickness, and we've learned in previous videos about direct armor and then effective armor. A shell has to basically be able to pin the tank's effective armor, whatever that is, at the trajectory that that shell is trying to penetrate that particular piece of armor. When this is determined, there is a randomness that happens in that. There's a and this could change depending on what World of Wargaming is doing to World of Tanks. I'm sorry, and they set this random number kind of modifier. And so there is a plus or minus 25% to penetration. So if, for example, you might be able to pin, let's say your shell pins 100 millimeter thickness of armor, okay? But the armor, but the general, the random number generator gave you a minus 25% to your kind of chance to penetrate, then you really only can penetrate 85% of the armor for that shell at that shot at that time. And so, if that armor is thicker than 85 millimeters, then you will have not been able to pin. So there is some randomness to how a shell penetrates a given armor thickness at a particular time. And so that's why I want to introduce RNG. So 25, there's a plus or minus 25% to actual pin or random modifier, and there's also a random modifier to damage, and it's plus or minus 25%. So if your gun typically does 100 damage and you wargaming determined at that particular time that you're pinning that tank, that you get a 25% damage. So it's anywhere between minus 25 and plus 25. So it may only be a plus 10%. So in this case, if we're doing 100% damage or 100 damage on average, then that's going to be 110 damage that we might do to that tank. So when people refer to RNG, RNG giveth and RNG taketh away, the RNG gods, that's what they're referring to, is this randomness that happens within the game. There is some luck involved, and so just know that RNG drives that particular functionality. Okay. The other thing, that we obviously have defined in the past, but we need to define now is, when I say pen, it means penetration, and I'm usually talking about effective armor. So again, all high explosive shells can do reduced damage if they fail to pen, but most shells have to penetrate the effective armor of a tank. And again, the effective armor takes into consideration angling, where the direct armor does not. So when I refer to pen in this video and henceforth, I'm referring to effective armor. And then damage, and damage is expressed as the average damage a shell can do. So another term that we have to kind of define here is normalization. There are certain shells that take advantage of normalization. And what normalization means is it takes away the angle of the armor, meaning that these shells tend to overmatch armor a little bit better. And what I mean by that is, even though your tank's armor might be angled, these types of shells generally can normalize that angle to some degree. So, for example, AP and APCR are a type of shell. AP stands for armor piercing, and the APCR is armor piercing composite rigid. And so these types of shells tend to normalize angles, meaning that they're affected less by the angling of a tank. And so they'll even it out a little bit more and reduce. If you think of it this way, they'll reduce the effective armor that they're trying to penetrate a little bit. So let's get into this in more detail. Let's talk about AP. AP is armor piercing. It's a standard shell. It's subject to 5 degrees of normalization. So what that means is, let's say you're angled at, let's say the armor is angled at 75% to the shell's trajectory. Well, that means that if you're shooting AP, then really the game is going to consider it being angled at 70%. So basically, it doesn't take away the armor angling. It just it makes it easier to pin people that are angled. So AP is armor piercing, and it is a little bit or does have what's called normalization a little bit. It's usually the cheapest and most versatile shell type that you'll have on your tanks. And so, I'm going to jump into the game here real quick, jump into World War II mode. I'm just going to pull up a particular tank, and just so you can kind of see as we talk about these different shell types. Like here, this type 1 is, I have an APHE, and then I have an APCR and an HE on this particular tank. So let me see if I can find a tank that only has, I don't know what. Yeah, these are different. They've termed these a little bit differently, but I don't want to get into the different particular names. But these are the types of shells. So we can move on. The next type of shell is the armor piercing composite rigid, which is APCR, and usually these are considered premium shell types. And so they also have 2 degrees of normalization, just 2 degrees. So they're similar to the AP type shell in that they will reduce the angle of the armor a little bit to make it a little bit easier to pin. They do lose speed faster over distance, so compared to the AP shell. So APCR is a little bit harder to pin further away, where AP is usually better to use when you're shooting at tanks further away. They're usually quite expensive, and they're usually, you need higher pin, such as against higher tier tanks or well armored enemies. So they usually have higher pin from the get-go. So I'm going to go back to my. So this has an APCR type here. And you can see when I select it here, the pin is 130 and 110. So this is at 100 meters. This is at 500 meters. Where if we look at our standard shells, it's only 81 and 69. Do you see that? So that it's a lot lower. Excuse me. It's a lot lower pin for standard shells than it is APCR. So that's why a lot of people that you hear these terms like spamming premium. A lot of people use premium shells just because it's always a little easier to pin tanks with premium shells. Now, like I mentioned, they're usually quite costly. In this tank's case, that's 1,600 silver versus 36. So that's quite a bit more for every shell you fire. That it costs 1,600 silver versus for every standard shell that you fire AP, it's 36. All right. So now we're going to get into the high explosive So there are high explosive standard. They're cheaper than they're usually cheaper than AP. The You should probably keep a small amount in your armament on a particular tank, and we'll get into, and I've mentioned this, high explosive rounds always do some damage to tanks when you even when you don't pin. So they're they're pretty standard on artillery. They're more based. They have more base damage than AP, APCR, or HEAT or heat rounds. Have low pin. So these generally do not pin well. So you can see that they. Let me go down here and you can see that's 90 hit points damage, right? And you can see this is 70 hit points damage. I'm looking right here. There's 90. There's 70. So it does more damage, but the problem is the pin is 25 and 25, and this is 130 and 110. So a lot lower pin for HE shells. But they tend to do some damage even though they don't pin. And the reason this is important is this is the type of shell that you generally want to use when you're going back to uncap somebody on the cap, because it doesn't matter whether you do a full amount of damage per shell, or if you just do 1 hit point of damage to that tank, he will lose all of his cap points if you're able to just do some damage to that tank. So that's why you want to really use HE shells when you're shooting people on the cap circle, because in order to just do damage, it's much easier to use HE, which will force them to lose all their cap points. Now, if you're wanting to kill the tank, obviously you can use APCR or AP shell rounds, but to really be able to make sure that you really hit them on the cap circle and reduce the cap points that they've accumulated, you want to use HE shells. So there's some other notes for HE shells. They do splash radius, so they explode on impact. They pre-detonate on spaced armor. So things like tracks and other tanks at higher tiers have spaced armor, and what happens is these shells are less effective against them because they pre-detonate in that spaced armor, and that's why the spaced armor is there, is to keep people from using HE rounds against you. And so just know that if you're in a game where you may be shooting at a tank that has spaced armor, well, then HE rounds are going to be a lot less effective against that tank. These HE rounds do have lower shell velocity, so I'll kind of show you the shell velocity here. In this particular case, this is 810 meters per second for that round. The APCR is a standard 810 meters per second there, and then these are also 810. Now, typically though, the rounds are slower. The HE rounds are slower, so that's not very typical, or it's a bad example. Distance doesn't affect pen value for HE rounds. Also another reason that you might want to use an HE round to hit a tank that's pretty far away, that you're having trouble pinning. Experience is the best teacher of when to use these. So what I mean by that is the kind of situations I'm mentioning, like you have a tank that's really far away, you're not doing any damage to him, but you want to go ahead and at least do some damage to him. Maybe you're trying to get him to move from his position, make him take cover. Maybe you're trying to just have covering fire because maybe your buddy's tracked, right? And you just want to get that tank to back off. Well, HE rounds might be a good shell type to use in that situation, because you're going to do some damage, hopefully some damage to that tank. Now, again, another situation is when the enemy team is capping, and you're going back to try to uncap them. And I'll do another video on capping, or just everything capping. But for the most part, that's another situation where you might want to use HE rounds. Howitzers are good use of HE rounds. They're a slow velocity gun anyway, and so when you're able to pen with them, they do huge amounts of damage. Usually set somebody on fire. You can do a lot of module damage with HE and a howitzer. So just know that that's a good time to up your number of HE rounds that you might carry on your tank. Hitting tanks on the cap. We've talked about poorly armored opponents like Arties or weak armored TVs. You might want to use HE rounds. Don't use this with guns less than 100 millimeter caliber. So if the gun is less than 100 millimeters, they just aren't going to have enough oomph to have really any chance at pinning at all. So you really want to use a gun that has a little bit beefier penetration. So tend to use them that have over 100 millimeters. Guns less than 120 millimeter caliber should not fire in tiers higher than 7. So just general guidance. Lights and specialist tanks, HE has a better chance of causing fire on ammo racks. So just know that if you're shooting at a light tank or maybe some kind of specialty tank, HE probably has a better chance to ammo rack that particular tank. So these are all really, really good tips on when to use or situations that you might want to use high explosive ammunition. All right, so we're moving on to the next type, which is high explosive premium ammo, and that's usually higher splash radius. And it's pretty much, the benefits are pretty much what we just went through with the other high explosive standard rounds, but the premium just has usually a larger splash radius. And then you have ammo called HEAT, H-E-A-T. That stands for high explosive anti-tank. This is also a premium ammunition. It has shaped charges. It's the choice of larger caliber, low velocity guns such as howitzers. Again, good to use in howitzers. Find as a premium ammo for Arties. So yeah, this typically Arties you'll equip this with your premium ammo with most Arties. It has highest pin in the game. So because it's shaped charges, it's going to be able to penetrate tanks a little bit easier, and therefore the shells will have a higher pin. Bad against angled armor, no normalization. So if you have someone firing heat at you, angle your tank. It is not good against angled tanks or angled armor. So if you also are trying to shoot a tank that has already angled armor, the heat shells are not necessarily ideal for shooting a tank like that. It doesn't lose pin over distance, but generally has a lower shell velocity. And we've talked about the pin over distance, but we haven't really talked about shell velocity really. The slower the shell, the more, if you're shooting from a distance or they're running across from left to right your preview, then the slower the shell velocity, the more lead time you have to use in order to land that shell on the target. And so this comes into play when tanks tend to auto lock, and the tank is running left to right or running a circle around them. If your shell velocity is somewhat slow, you cannot use auto lock on another tank and be able to hit them on the move. You're going to have to unlock and manually aim. You can use auto lock to initially target them and then manually aim where you want to place the shot. But the shell velocity has to do with how quick that shell gets from the end of your barrel or out your gun to target. So it's measured in meters per second. And anything 1,000 plus is pretty fast. Anything less than 1,000 is a little slower, and some of them get really slow. So just know that shell velocity is important, and when you're trying to shoot for accuracy, the faster the shell velocity, the better off you are. Okay. Can pre-detonate. These shells can pre-detonate like HE shells against spaced armor. So spaced armor is effective against heat shells. No splash damage. No damage if no pin. So heat shells, even though they're high explosive anti-tank, these shells specifically, because they have such high pin anyway, do not get splash damage. They do not do damage if there is no pin. So you have to pin with a heat shell. It doesn't lose pin over distance though. So if you're shooting a tank further away, then just know that the heat shell is just as good as whether you were right up next to them. It does generally, the heat shell generally has a slower shell velocity though, so that means you probably have to lead them a little bit more if they're further away or whatever. Never fire at tracks or other spaced armor. So this is a type of shell that you wouldn't want to fire a heat shell at spaced armor or tracks, because tracks are considered spaced armor. So just know you're not going to try to track somebody with heat shells. It's going to be a lot harder to do. And then there is another shell type called high explosive squash head or HESH, or some tanks it's HEP, which is high explosive plastic. This type of armor, the HESH and the HEP, are a premium type of armor, and what they do is they spread a paste on the outside of the tank when they hit the tank, and they behave similar to HE and sometimes are labeled HE. So it's kind of like they spread a paste and they kind of set it on fire. So even though these tend to they don't pin a lot of times, they still do a lot of damage because they do burn damage and so on. So HESH is a pretty good type of ammo. Now again, going to be less effective against spaced armor, so just know that. All right, so kind of talked about normalization. So I'm going to kind of go through these and kind of recap some things that we want to really consider here. So AP, it is a shell that is normalized. So it's 5 degrees normalization. It does overmatch. So it is a shell that will overmatch. It's affected by distance. Okay, AP is affected by distance. Not as much as APCR, but still affected by distance. It can pre-detonate? No. AP does not pre-detonate. It either pins or it doesn't pin. And it angled ricochet is 70 degrees or better. So if your tank is angled at 70 degrees, typically you're going to ricochet an AP shell. Okay? Now, you're probably going to have to be angled at 75 degrees because it has normalization of 5 degrees. Okay, so think about that. So APCR, it gets a 2 degree normalization. It can overmatch. It is affected by distance. It does not pre-detonate, and it also ricochets at 70 degrees. HE or HESH does not get normalization, so that doesn't apply. It doesn't overmatch. Okay, it doesn't overmatch the armor of the tank, and it is affected. It is not affected by distance. HE and HESH are not affected by distance. And then it can pre-detonate, or in other words, it is not effective or as effective against a spaced armor. Okay, and then the ricochet, there is no ricochet with HE or HESH. You splash them for damage. They can't ricochet it, so there is no angle to ricochet it. And then heat does not get normalization. It does not overmatch the armor. It is not affected by distance, and it can pre-detonate. So it's not effective against spaced armor, and you have to be angled at 85 degrees to ricochet a heat shell. So muzzle velocity, generally speaking, AP is the average, usually has an average muzzle velocity. It has no splash damage. APCR, it usually has the fastest muzzle velocity that you have for your tank, but it does not have splash damage either. HE and HESH is slower than AP and APCR shells, but it does have splash damage. And then heat shells have a slower muzzle velocity generally than AP and APCR, and they do not have splash damage. So there you go. That's most everything you need to know about the different ammo types. So let's step back here for a second and let's talk about, okay, that's great. We've learned about all these ammo types. In general, when you're at tier, meaning your tier or below, most of your shots, most of your shells should be standard shells. This is my opinion now. We're into my opinion. Most of your shells should be, or most of your shots should be with standard shells. So that's your cheapest ammo type. It'll be the most effective ammo to pin tanks at your tier or below, meaning that it'll have generally most times enough pin power to go through tanks at your tier or below. Now there are certain tanks, maybe there's heavies at your tier that it won't pin, and so know that if you come up against those, that maybe you'll have to load your specialty shells like your APCR, or if you're in a special situation, maybe you load your HE, HESH, heat, or whatever else you have in a special situation. Now, when you're playing tiered up, meaning tanks that are a tier higher or maybe even 2 tiers higher than you, that's when you're generally going to want to shoot more APCR type shells, because they'll have the higher pin, and you'll need the higher pin in order to maybe damage tanks that are got thicker armor than what you normally face in that tank. Now, there will be some tanks in those higher tiers that you may not be able to pin even with your APCR, and that's when your HE and your high explosive shells come in, because even though you won't be able to pin them, you'll be able to do some damage to them. But in general, you don't want to be taking on tanks with HE shells. if that's the fight, you're in a bad situation. But that is where you'd want to use them. Now, remember, HE shells are good to use against not low tier, the bad armored opponents, like those tank destroyers, some of those tank destroyers, and certainly artillery. Load HE and pump an HE into one of those, because you're probably going to pin them, and you're going to do a lot of damage when you do it. So that's generally speaking when you'd want to use these types of shells and so on. So I know there's a lot to cover. You might have to listen to this video a second time, and that's okay. If you have comments or questions or things that you'd like for me to cover that I didn't in this video, please leave a comment. I appreciate the feedback. I'll definitely take it under consideration in a future video. As always, I appreciate your time. If this video was helpful, please hit the like button, and of course subscribe if you like the content that I'm producing here, and hit the bell if you want to get notification of any new videos I upload. Alright guys, now that you know your different shell types, I hope you have better luck on the battlefield. See you out there, and good luck.